of this morning's broadcast. And this hour of news and views is sponsored by Africa Muslims Agency. Africa Muslims Agency, a beacon of hope to communities for over 35 years in Africa and beyond. Time now to reflect on the life and legacy of Marhoom Yusuf Bhamjee, rahimahullah, a committed patriot, lifelong activist, and exemplary leader. And to reflect on his life and his legacy, we joined by family spokesperson Yunus Karim, who is also an ANC and SACP veteran. Yunus Bhai, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jummah Mubarak to you and welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, and also to your listeners.
Yes, from what I've seen, from what has been written about the late Yusuf Bhamjee, obviously speaks volumes, and I'm sure you and I can spend the better part of an hour and to try and obviously compress his life and legacy in a few minutes won't do justice. But there is just so much that stands out about this extraordinary personality. When you reflect on his life and legacy, what stands out for you, Brother Yunus?
Well, firstly, as I've said before, he's the always there politician, most of all for his constituents. And that's a hallmark of a good member of parliament. You are there ultimately elected, as we have been, to serve ordinary people. And that was his great strength. But he was always there in many other senses. He was there, interestingly, here in Msunduzi, Pietermaritzburg, at possibly every wedding, every funeral, every wedding anniversary, everybody's birthday. He was very rooted in the community, in the way others of us who were in parliament and served as the same generation as him in activism weren't necessarily. But he was always there too, deep in the rural areas of KZN, very active in the informal settlements here in Msunduzi, Pietermaritzburg, in the northern areas, the former Indian and so-called colored group areas. He was there when the troubles broke out, the violence between the IFP and the ANC in the early 1990s and spilling over into the post-1994 period for the first few years until, we secured a degree of peace here in this province. In Naledi, for example, the township in Richmond, the big one, he was there. I said to him several times, look, Yusuf, you have to take precautions. You can't just plunge into the rural areas and townships which are violence-ridden. You're not an MEC, you don't have official protectors and so on. So, of course, as a self-defense mechanism, he got himself a gun and learned to use it, but he also appointed or employed, whom he paid for, a protector. So he's a remarkable guy, and he, more than most of us in the post-1994 period, did a lot to break down barriers between particularly the Indian and African communities, which is so sorely needed.
Yes, and also I think we have people who serve in government who are members of parliament, but what is actually stood out in just looking at some of the tributes that have come through, talking about his leadership style, which was very, very unique, and he emulated true leadership as well, and being outstanding in more ways than one, particularly looking at as a leader how he inspired people, and also looking at the youth and the younger generation in South Africa, Brother Yunus.
Well, he did a lot to make the youth of the ANC Youth League, the youth in the northern areas, as I said, become aware of the history of the country. In the case of Indian South Africans, the history of the Natal and Transvaal Indian Congresses, and the contribution Indian South Africans have made to the liberation struggle, and made them aware that there's a history. Young people today, across all color divides, are unaware of the ANC and the history of Congress as a whole, and he did much in that regard. Obviously, he wasn't alone. He worked as part of a collective. And obviously, all of us who are activists, we make contributions in our own right. but we are also a product of the movement we're from. In other words, we help in our own little ways to shape the ANC and the Congress movement broadly, but we are also shaped by it. In other words, there's a dialectic, a mutually reinforcing relationship between what we have to offer as individuals and what the movement offers us. Now, this is not to deny that the movement, the ANC-led movement, has been decaying for several years now and is nowhere near the movement that we became a part of in the early 70s. It is sad and bad where we are, but for many of us, there is no other option. In this province, the alternatives are not the DA or the ANC, as I've said repeatedly on the eve of the 2024 elections. It's really between the MKP stroke EFF and the ANC. So we're the better option of not very good options. But I'm not here to campaign. There's no election looming. I'm making the point that you can't separate individuals from the movement, no matter how decayed it is now, that we come from. It shaped our thinking. Now, also, you have to understand that to understand Yusuf, he made his own contribution in his own right. You have to understand the Bhamjee family. They're a very well-rooted family here. Originally from Walmeridstad, they came to Maritzburg, as it was called then, in 1956. Shortly after that, they set up the Bhamjee shoe store. At one stage, it was the only shoe store in the bottom end of the business sector, what was the Indian group areas, the Church Street, the longest street here at that stage. And at the bottom end was the typical apartheid group areas. And, I think in every Indian household, probably at that time in the 60s, that's his brother Hanif on the screen I see now. He was head of the anti-apartheid movement in Cardiff. He left the country in the early 60s. So Hanif was active. So was Yusuf. And then there's the third brother, Ismail. Bhamjee was very active in SACOS and the anti-apartheid sports movement and in sport itself. And then there was Shabir, the oldest brother, who wasn't so active, but created the space for the other three brothers to be active. There were no sisters. To come back to the point I'm making, the Bhamjee shoe store was an iconic store. Everybody bought their shoes there. And as the African people of our city became upwardly mobile, they were also streaming into the shop. And of course, even whites who wanted to get a better deal or look for shoes of a certain size. I'm told by Zoefa Bhamjee that she had a lecturer, for example, who had big feet and could never, in the elite shops in the former white group area, business area, get those sizes. I don't know what size it was. And she finally was told by Zoefa, why didn't you try Bhamjee shoe store? And there it was. She found the shoe she was looking for. And Mrs. Bhamjee, Aisha Bhamjee, was the matriarch. She loomed over the entire family. She was a remarkably business-savvy person, but also very kind. She would say to her daughter-in-laws and sons, our customers are part of the family. Never let a customer go. And she was very willing at times to forego the full price. So if somebody came to you and said, look, I've got 3 children, I can't afford to pay for all the school shoes, she'd say, okay, don't pay it all now and pay us a smaller price. So the Bhamjees are very rooted, very hospitable. What was remarkable was that there was no such thing as Hindu and Muslim and all that. They respected all religions. I used to go there every second or third Saturday evening to the extended family household in Payat Road, Newhams. And they had this very long table. And you would see the Jagmohans there and the Naikas there as much as the Karims there and so on. There was no such division of Muslim and Hindu. In fact, in the household, because of the Young Italians Football Club, which they had a lot a role in, the Bhamjees, often the people that came, they were not Muslim. And that's right, in my view. I think ultimately each person chooses or decides or is shaped by their birth on which religion they go for. But the values of all religions ultimately are the same. And these divisions we have, they're increasing now ever so much, are totally uncalled for in my view. And the Bhamjee's family, if nothing else, exemplifies that, as does Yusuf Bhamjee. Most of his friends were not even Muslim. So, I just want to convey that to you and to your listeners. You may not agree with me, but that's your call. It's my right to speak you've called me here to this program. I didn't ask to be here, so I will express my point of view. That's a great lesson of theirs. Thank you.
Well, certainly, in fact, we've also grown up in those traditional group areas, traditional Indian areas. And I think where we grew up was exactly the same as well. Where we grew up, we
Yes.
schooled together with all the different communities, the different denominations. So, we can strongly identify with what you are saying, Brother Yunus. And just coming back to Yusuf Bamji and his sacrifices. I just like to focus a bit on sacrifices, and I'm sure a lot actually comes to mind in terms of some of the struggles and sacrifices that he had to endure.
Well, it was no different from other activists. I don't think one can say, as Indian activists, we bore the brunt of it. That's a misunderstanding. You see, we are relatively well resourced in the struggle era as well. We are formally educated. Our income was higher than our African comrades. They bore the brunt of the sacrifices, not us. It's sort of like, I think, inappropriate to highlight people of Indian descent. The main struggle, many of them died here. From 1986 to about 1996, something like 30,000 people died here. Some were in the IFP, some were in the UDF stroke ANC. But a majority of them were civilians. They were not involved on either side. They bore the brunt of the violence. Many of them were unemployed youths, listless, rudderless. All they had was a belief that apartheid had to go. There are so many of our friends, Skumbuso and Gwenya, Reggie Hadebe, Tutugo, all of them were killed in the violence. Others were in Mkonto Wisizwe, and they went out into exile. They suffered the consequences of living in camps in Angola and training with the sparest of resources. And some died in the struggle. Some got sick and died subsequently. They bore the brunt of the struggle. Yusuf, myself, and others of my generation, we didn't bear the brunt of it. But obviously, we could have chosen lives of a better option that might have meant better salaries and so on. But if you think about it, my friend, look at the salaries we earn in Parliament. I happen to be a senior lecturer in sociology. Yusuf was a part time lecturer in politics, and he was in the Development Studies Research Group. The salaries we got in May 1994 were considerably higher than what I got as a senior lecturer in sociology, or Yusuf for that matter. And in fact, even if I was professor of sociology or head of the faculty, I still wouldn't have got the salary you could get today and then as a backbencher. So in some senses, if you're talking of sacrifices, yes, I suppose we gave up our family lives to take part in the struggle, but ultimately, my friend, we didn't sacrifice anywhere near so many of our comrades in the townships did.
Yes, and just finally, and early on, obviously, you spoke about the political landscape as it is today at this point in time. And just towards the end of his life, I'm sure yourself and Yusuf Bamji must have had many a discussion as to how this political landscape since our liberation, since 1994, how this has actually evolved over a period of time and where we are today. What were some of his thoughts when he sees, what is in government today?
Yeah, his thoughts were no different from many of us. They weren't distinct. They were part of a collective. Those of us that emerged in the early 70s, I got to know Yusuf in 1983. Coincidentally, he was in Ireland studying politics, and I had a UN scholarship after 1976 detention at UDW and ended up in the UK. I never met him, but in 83, coincidentally, he came back at the same time I did. We didn't know each other. I met him shortly after, and then we both ended up in the Development Studies Research Group and in the university, and then he ended up in the provincial legislature, and I happened to end up in the National Assembly. So I know him extremely well over the years. He was not a revolutionary angel, neither was Madiba. I mean, all of us can't be Walter Sisulu or Lali Chiba. He, like all of us, had his faults, but his faults were far outweighed by his strengths. And he, like all of us, who, well, not all of us, most of us of the early 70s generation, and think about those who came before. Think about those who spent years and years on Robben Island. Think of those who came back from the camps or Robben Island and so on, as I said. I mean, how must it be for them to see where the ANC is today? It is very sad and very bad. And what is worrying people like me and him, I know we both spoke as recently as, well, the last conversation we had, interestingly, was about why is the SACP taking part in elections on its own? He had donated towards us and he said he wants his money back. So I explained to him it's not what he thinks it is. But we are in a very bad place. And my own view remains that civil society, religious organizations, radio stations like yourself, teachers, university lecturers, NPOs, social movements, community organizations, ordinary citizens must rescue this democracy. You see, ultimately, although the ANC led us, and the ANC rightly became the power it did after 1994, ultimately, who liberated us? It's the masses, ordinary people, under the banner mostly of the ANC, but also there were others, ASAPO, PAC, and others who weren't linked to any structure. It is the masses who must rescue this democracy. You can't rely on the state and political parties alone. We need a massive UDF type, United Democratic Front type movement that this time engages with the state in a dialectical way, if you like, where the state does good things like a basic income grant and NHI, incrementally, of course. We support the state. We support the government and the ANC. But where it does stupid things like corruption and so on, and refuses to fix the electricity crisis now at the municipal level more, then we must tackle it through mass struggles. That's how we're going to rescue this democracy. But for us, Yusuf and me and others, we ain't giving up. No, no, no. We say, as decayed as our movement is, the alternatives are far worse, far, far worse. And you can see it in this province with the looming MKP EFF coalition, though they have their differences. So what I'm saying to you, my friend, Yusuf's thoughts on this were no different from what the majority of us of that generation and earlier feel where the movement is. But this is our country. The country doesn't belong to the government or the ANC, to which I remain committed, and the Communist Party, to which I remain committed. This country belongs to the people. This democracy came about through the mass struggles of people, ordinary people. You say you were there too? Great. Now, here we are. We must rescue this democracy, working in cooperation with and in conflict with, where it's necessary, the government, the ANC, and the state.
Well, Jazakallah shukran for that. I wish we had a lot more time, but we do appreciate you taking time out this morning, obviously reflecting on the life and the legacy of this great giant, Marhoom Yusuf Bhamjee. We make dua that Allah grant him Jannah, inshallah, and also to his family as well. Our condolences obviously go into all those who have been associated with him, his close fans, family, his colleagues, his comrades, all of them as well. But for now, we thank you, Brother Yunus.
Thank you very
Assalamu
much.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Thank
barakatuh.
you.
Yunus Kareem joining us this morning and reflecting on the life and legacy of Marhoom Yusuf Bhamjee. Next up, Naeem Jinnah will be joining us. We're looking at the Trump administration and his plans to revoke student visas, particularly those that have been involved in pro-Palestinian protests.